we're going to get started making a mug rug. So the first step that we're going to do is make this pinwheel quilt block, and then we're going to sew all the fabrics together, and then the last step is going to be putting this button on. So the first thing that we're going to work with is the 5.5 inch squares that came in your kit. So you have enough for 2 mug rugs, so make sure that the squares that you choose are different colors. That's what's going to give us the cool pinwheel pattern. What you're going to do is make sure that we put these right sides together. We're going to just line these up with each other and then sew around the outside. Once we get this sewn around the outside, you may be wondering, how do we go from this to this cool diagonal kind of pinwheel pattern? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to cut diagonally from corner to corner both ways, kind of like you would cut a grilled cheese sandwich if you wanted the cool little triangle pieces. Once we have that cut, what do we do next? Well, we are going to iron these open. Remember, we're putting the seam allowance towards the dark side. That is all done. So now what we can do is, if we arrange this like so, we can kind of see how this pinwheel is going to turn into this. Now the first step is to sew these two together and these two together. So we're just going to take these, put them right sides together, and then sew along this edge. Do that with both of these sets. Once that's done and you've ironed that seam allowance, we're going to be stuck with 2 pieces here, like so. Can you see how the pinwheel is starting to come through? So next step is we want to make sure that we put the 2 edges with these points that converge together, and then we are going to sew along this edge. Now once that's done, all we need to do is open this guy up and iron this center seam allowance down flat. Now this one might take a little bit longer and a little more pressure with your iron, just because it's a lot thicker. So once we have that all done, we're going to connect this side piece. You should have a long skinny piece here. And all we're going to do is stick it to the side here. So I'm going to put my right sides together and then sew along this edge. Once this is done, I'm going to press this seam allowance out towards this little piece that we just added on here. That'll make things a lot easier. Press that down, and look, it's starting to look similar, isn't it? So our next step is going to be putting in all these cute little lines here. You can skip this step if you want, but I'm going to show you how to go ahead and do that. So our next thing that we're going to need to add is this insulation layer, and basically you're just going to kind of line this up along here so that it's mostly even. It might not be exactly even because this insulation layer was cut square, but every time that we sew all these little pieces together, that gets a little wonky, but we'll fix that in our last step. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my pins and I'm going to pin this together. So I'm going to go perpendicular here of these lines as they go across. That way I can sew across them. If I was going to go parallel and I sewed here, I would hit this head of the pin. So I'm just going to do probably these main ones here. Okay, now the beauty of this is now that it's pinned, it's not going anywhere. So we can run this through the sewing machine. What I'm going to do is show you how to do that on a couple of these, And you can do it on every single cross stitch here that we have. As you can see in this one, I've done both sides of each of these seams. I'm just going to show you really quick on this one over here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to not set the needle so that it goes up the center. You can if you want, and that would be a good way to quilt it down, but I'm going to show you how to put a line up each side. So we're going to offset our foot just a little bit so that we are sewing just right on the right side here. I'm going to hold my threads and start going. Now you are going to leave these pins in, just sew very carefully over the top of them. You don't want to hit them with your sewing machine needle. Now you can see here how we've got stitching that goes down the one side. Now we're just going to offset the other direction and go down the other side. Alright, so now we've got this nice stitch on both sides, and what you can do if you want is do that on every single one of these lines, and that's how you get a nice quilted look. If you have chosen to quilt all of these, then you can take all the pins out. If not, leave those pins in, except for the ones that you sewed along, because that stitching is going to take the place of the pin. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take this back piece and we're going to put right side to right side. Now you can see that this is a little bit bigger than this turned out. What we're going to do is line it up with the edge that's not the pinwheel. So I'm going to pin this together. And then we'll pin all the way down the edge, but when we sew, we're going to match it up with this side that's shorter. That way we make sure that we don't leave a hole. Now it may sound weird that we are pinning this inside out to sew it together, but what we'll end up doing is leaving a little hole so that we can turn it right side out. Okay, so I'm going to decide that I'm going to leave my hole on this end over here. So you probably want it at least big enough for a few of your fingers to fit through. I'm going to leave it most of this size. So just reverse stitch here, sew all the way around, and then reverse stitch here, leaving a hole. Now remember here that our bottom piece is smaller, so I'm feeling with my finger here until I get almost to the edge, and then I'm just going to turn and sew straight down. Next step is to pull out all these pins, and then we're going to turn it right side out. Alright, so we're going to reach in between the two fabric pieces. Be careful if you have any pins left in there, you don't want to get poked. Okay, so now I can see these pins. I'm going to pull these out so I don't get poked. And their job is done because everything's sewn together. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my finger and stick it in here to poke these corners out really sharp. And what you can also do is use some scissors here just to get that corner poked out really square. Now once we have all these poked out, we're going to iron this flat. See, it's starting to take shape. Now this might take a little bit more iron pressure and time here, just because of the thickness of all the fabric that we sewed at all these seams. We want this to lie pretty flat because our next step is going to be sewing all the way around this outside edge. The reason we're going to do that is because we need to close this hole. So do you see here how these fabrics are trying to turn in on themselves? That's good because we don't want any of those raw edges sticking out. So I'm just going to fold them in so that this line is straight and go ahead and give that a really good iron, because this iron will help keep that held together there so we can sew over it pretty easy and close that hole. So you can put some pins in there if you want. If you did a really good ironing job, you won't need to. I'm going to head over to the sewing machine and sew a little bit in from the edge all the way around. So now we're going to check and make sure that we can't get any raw edges in this hole, and I've tacked that up pretty good. And then the next step is going to be hand sewing on these buttons. So we've got some snow buttons here. You can put 1, you can put 2, you can put 3, and you can arrange them however you want. So that is the fun part of this one. I hope that you had fun. Share pictures with me. I would love to see them. Happy sewing!